Hi everyone, thank you so much for clicking on my presentation. The historian that I chose for this project is Daniel Boorstin. Boorstin was a 20th century American historian, especially noted for his study of social history. He was also a longtime educator and served as a Librarian of Congress between 1975 and 1987. And Boorstin made significant contributions to the consensus school of history, which, if you'll remember, we talked about in class. Moving on then to Boorstin's early life and education. Boorstin was born on October 1st, 1914 in Atlanta, Georgia. As a young man, he attended Harvard and graduated in 1937. Then he went on to study at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and received not one, but 2 law degrees. Then he still wasn't sick of school, so he attended Yale and received yet another degree, this time a doctorate of law. In April of 1941, he married the writer and editor Ruth Frankel. And it's very interesting because when he met Ruth from 1941 on, he always included her in the acknowledgement sections of his books. Quite often his books are actually dedicated to her. And when she died, the Washington Post printed her obituary and quoted Boorstin in saying, "Without her, I think my works would have been twice as long and half as readable." So clearly, Ruth meant a great deal to Boorstin in both his personal life and his professional life. Boorstin was also an educator and taught at Swarthmore College, but then moved for a longer period of time to the University of Chicago, and he taught there for 25 years. Boorstin's political leanings are also very important to how he approached history and just his career as a historian in general. Boorstin joined the Communist Party in the late 1930s, but he briefly left the party in 1939 when Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland. He then joined back for a little while, but by the 1950s, he was actually changing his tune quite radically and becoming increasingly and steadily more conservative in his political leanings and his interpretation of culture. And this is really something that has provoked a lot of criticism throughout his career and even after his death. He attacked quite viciously New Left historians throughout the 1960s, and he is sometimes lumped in with the authors and historians who made an impact during the rise of American conservatism in the 1970s and 1980s, which is definitely a point of contention about his career. Nonetheless, his political leanings certainly inspired Boorstin's works, which we will talk about in just a minute. Moving on then to continuing to look at his very full career. In addition to serving as an educator for many years, Boorstin became the director of the Smithsonian's Museum of History and Technology, which would later be renamed the Museum of American History, and he was appointed to that position in 1969. In 1975, under the presidency of Gerald Ford, Boorstin was appointed a Librarian of Congress, which was a position that he held until 1987. And during this period, he was very outspoken about his love of learning and books. When he retired, he was quoted in saying the following quote, which I have up here on the screen, and I think this really speaks to his philosophy not only of learning, but also of history. He said, "The Librarian of Congress is supposed to help people learn and not preach to them or even teach them. I'm very wary of people who give us the lessons of history or the laws for the future of cultures. But I do think one thing the historian can do is to warn us against the overgeneralizations of social scientists, politicians, preachers, all those who think they're in on the secrets of the future." While Boorstin certainly didn't pretend to know what the future was bringing, he was very critical of culture while he was alive. And so I think this quote is quite interesting, especially when contrasted against the type of work that he did as a historian. This is a good transition point into Boorstin's approach to history and his notable works. As a consensus historian of the 20th century, Boorstin emphasized agreed-upon elements of history rather than points of contention. He also sought to write for the amateur in history. He was very passionate about focusing on and recovering the forgotten commonplaces of our American history. Though, as we talked about before, he was an incredibly smart man with a lot of experience in academia, it's really interesting that he had such a real heart for the general audience, and he wanted to write for them, and that's something he did. But this was very controversial, especially how he sort of presented information to the common person who was reading his book. He tended to downplay what he saw as sort of lofty ideas in intellectual history in favor of something more practical and focusing on the problem solvers in history. He also placed fascinating emphasis on technology, everything from mundane inventions like condensed milk to bigger ones like the telephone up to the atomic bomb. But for this reason, Thomas Jefferson was really Boorstin's hero, and he wrote a book about Jefferson because Jefferson was always interested in and curious about new things and just the world around him, and that was something that Boorstin really wanted to kind of embody. However, as a political and cultural conservative, Boorstin was mistrustful and critical of the negative side effects of a modernizing society. And this is particularly reflected in his book, The Image, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Boorstin wrote over 20 books, and his works have been translated into 32 languages. And he wrote on a wide variety of subjects, and obviously I have not included 20 plus books here in this presentation. Instead, I've decided just to look at a select few of his influential and prize-winning works. So Boorstin grouped a lot of his books into trilogies, and one of his first very popular trilogies was The Americans. And those books included The Americans, The Colonial Experience, which was the winner of the Bancroft Prize, The Americans, The National Experience, which was the winner of the Parkman Prize, and The Americans, The Democratic Experience, which was the winner of the Dexter Prize and the Pulitzer Prize. The Americans actually very well showcased his belief that America had this distinct character that was quite separate from the old world. And so he argued that throughout history, these character traits like self-reliance, inventiveness, and, unsurprisingly, pragmatism took shape over time. And so Boorstin takes a definite social approach to the presentation of this information. He focuses on people, material culture, technology, and that kind of thing. Another important trilogy that he wrote later was The Discoverers, The Creators, and The Seekers. And this is a time when he focuses more on world history and actually does engage intellectual history a little bit more than before, kind of breaking from his subject matter that he'd written on earlier in his career. So in The Discoverers, Boorstin organizes the book around what he calls dimensions of experience, and these include time, earth, seas, nature, and society. And Boorstin explains how man seeks to learn and explore all of these different realms. However, he does not so much discuss politics or culture. Rather, he states his purpose quite clearly in the introduction when he writes, "My focus remains on mankind's need to know what is out there." So that's really what he's trying to showcase here. Moving on then to the creators, obviously this is something where Boorstin is focusing on man's creativity. He discusses everything from painting to music, architecture, philosophy, theater, and even religious expression. However, this book is criticized because critics have noted that Boorstin is a bit biased towards kind of the West and sort of the Western tradition rather than a global approach to this subject matter. In The Seekers, he definitely engages intellectual history here when he studies religious figures and thinkers of many faiths. He talks about, and as well as secular thinkers, he talks about ancient classical thinkers, religious figures like Moses and Muhammad, Enlightenment thinkers, even theologians like Kierkegaard, and he traces this all the way up into the 20th century. And then jumping back in time a bit, The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America, was published in 1964, and this is one of Boorstin's most controversial and famous works. Boorstin was actually inspired to write it after the televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960. And essentially, this is just a real assessment of 20th century American culture. And so he is quite critical of modern culture and believes that the American people has sort of shrugged off pragmatism and truthfulness in favor of the image, the non-event, and the celebrity. Boorstin defines the celebrity as a person who is known for being well-known and spin. And so he criticizes the, quote, dark arts of advertising and public relations that kind of creates this world that isn't real, that is sort of an illusion. And we definitely see his conservatism and his dedication to pragmatism really showcase itself here. If you know anything about that debate between Nixon and JFK, you definitely understand how image was very important to who ended up winning that debate. And so you can see why Boorstin was inspired by it. So here are a few more sources that I consulted in addition to Boorstin's works, of course. Thank you so much once again for listening, and have a great rest of your week.